Harlem, 1945. A black schoolteacher named Robert Bandy stepped off a bus at 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, briefcase in hand. Lesson plans for Monday morning tucked inside. He'd spent 12 years teaching mathematics to children, whose parents called him Professor, with reverence in their voices. He wore wire-rimmed glasses, a modest brown suit he'd saved 3 months to buy, and the quiet dignity of a man who believed education could change the world. He never made it home. What happened next on that October evening would force the most powerful police official in New York City to do something unprecedented. Apologize on live radio to a black man. But the apology wouldn't come from conscience or justice. It would come because Bumpy Johnson decided it would, and when Bumpy Johnson decided something in Harlem, even City Hall had to listen. October 12, 1945, 7:43 p.m. Robert Bandy was walking north on Lenox Avenue when State Trooper William Harrigan pulled his patrol car alongside him. What provoked Harrigan that evening? No one knows for certain. Maybe it was the way Bandy walked with his head up. Maybe it was the briefcase that suggested education, aspiration, a life beyond what Harrigan thought a black man in Harlem deserved. Maybe Harrigan was just the kind of man who enjoyed wielding power over those who couldn't fight back. Harrigan stepped out of the car. He didn't ask questions. He didn't request identification. He simply grabbed Bandy by the collar and slammed him against the hood of the patrol car. Bandy's glasses flew off, skittering across the sidewalk. His briefcase hit the pavement, spilling papers into the gutter. Geometry proofs and vocabulary lists floating in dirty water. "Where'd you steal that briefcase, boy?" Bandy tried to explain. He was a teacher. He lived 6 blocks away. The briefcase was his, purchased at a shop on 116th Street. He could prove it. He reached for his wallet. Harrigan took that reach as resistance. The first blow came fast, a nightstick across Bandy's ribs, then another and another. Bandy crumpled to the sidewalk, arms up to protect his head, trying to speak through the pain, trying to reason with unreasonable violence. A crowd gathered. This wasn't unusual in Harlem. Police brutality was as common as the autumn wind cutting down from the Hudson. But something about this beating felt different. Robert Bandy wasn't a hustler or a numbers runner. He was Professor Bandy, who tutored kids for free at the library on Saturdays, who attended Abyssinian Baptist Church every Sunday, who represented everything parents in Harlem wanted their children to become. Harrigan didn't care. He kicked Bandy twice in the stomach, then grabbed him by the hair and dragged him toward the patrol car. Bandy's face was bleeding. His suit was torn. His dignity, built over decades of excellence in a world that rarely acknowledged black excellence, was being destroyed on a public street in front of his own community. One witness, a young man named Marcus Webb, stepped forward. He pulled out a small camera he'd bought from a pawn shop the week before. He started taking pictures. Click, the nightstick raised. Click, the Bandy's face, blood running down his cheek. Click, the crowd watching in helpless fury. Harrigan noticed the camera. He lunged toward Marcus, but the young man was faster. He ran, ducking into an alley. The camera clutched to his chest like it was made of gold, because in that moment, it was worth more than gold. It was evidence. It was truth. It was the thing that could make power accountable. Harrigan threw Bandy into the back of the patrol car and drove away. He booked him on charges of disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. Robert Bandy spent that night in a cell at the 28th Precinct, his broken ribs making every breath of agony, his mind unable to comprehend how walking home from a bus stop had turned into this nightmare. But while Bandy sat in that cell, something else was happening in Harlem. The word was spreading. Not through newspapers, but the mainstream press wouldn't cover it. Not through official channels. No one expected justice. From those, the word spread through the network that actually ran Harlem. The invisible infrastructure of policy, banks and social clubs and corner stores. where information flowed faster than electricity. By midnight, Bumpy Johnson knew everything. Bumpy Johnson, in 1945, was already a legend. He'd survived wars with Dutch Schultz, navigated the treacherous politics of the Italian five families, and built an empire on the principle that Harlem belonged to Harlem, not to outside mobs, not to corrupt police, to the people who lived there, worked there, raised their children there. Bumpy had rules. You didn't hurt working people. You didn't destroy the institutions that held the community together. You didn't touch the teachers, the preachers, the shopkeepers who formed the backbone of black life in Harlem. Those people were sacred. They were the reason everyone else hustled so their kids could become like them. Trooper Harrigan had just broken every rule that mattered. Bumpy sat in his office above Small's Paradise at 2:17 a.m. when Marcus Webb arrived with the photographs. Bumpy studied each one in silence. His face remained expressionless, but everyone in the room understood what dark that stillness meant. It was the calm before calculated devastation. Bumpy made 3 phone calls. The first was to Stephanie St. Clair, the legendary Queenie, who ran policy banks across Harlem and had connections that reached into City Hall itself. The second was to Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., the young pastor of Abyssinian Baptist who was already building a political career on the promise of fighting for his people. The third was to a lawyer named Edward Dudley, one of the few black attorneys in New York who wasn't afraid to take on the police department. By dawn, the strategy was set. This wouldn't be handled in the streets. Violence would have been easier, simpler, more immediately satisfying. Harrigan could have vanished. Accidents happened to state troopers who operated alone in hostile territory. But Bumpy understood something crucial about power in 99999999999. The 45 real victory wasn't making your enemy disappear. Real victory was making your enemy submit publicly, on record, in a way that changed the rules for everyone who came after. October 13th, 8 a.m. Robert Bandy was released from the 28th precinct. The charges were still on the books, but he was free on his own recognizance. He went home, where his wife wept at the sight of his battered face. His principal sent word that he should take the week off to heal. His students, when they heard what happened, organized a march that their parents quickly shut down, not because they didn't care, but because they knew marching black children in 1945 was just giving the police more targets. But Bumpy was already moving pieces into position. Edward Dudley filed a formal complaint with the police commissioner's office, documenting every detail of the assault. Adam Clayton Powell mentioned the incident in his sermon that Sunday, his voice thundering through Abyssinian Baptist, condemning a system that hired men like Harrigan and gave them badges to legitimize their racism. The photographs that Marcus Webb had taken appeared in the Amsterdam News, the black newspaper that served Harlem. White newspapers ignored the story, but the Amsterdam News put it on the front page. Harlem teacher beaten by State Trooper Commissioner silent. The images were damning. Robert Bandy's bloodied face, Harrigan's nightstick raised, the crowd of witnesses watching in horror. The police commissioner, Louis Valentine, was a career bureaucrat who'd navigated decades of New York politics by avoiding controversy. His initial response to the Bandy beating was predictable: an internal investigation, which everyone knew meant nothing would happen. Harrigan might get a reprimand, maybe a week's suspension, then back to business as usual. But Commissioner Valentine didn't understand what he was dealing with. This wasn't just about one teacher and one trooper. This was about Bumpy Johnson deciding that the line had been crossed, and Bumpy had resources. Valentine couldn't comprehend. Stephanie St. Clair made calls to her political contacts. She'd been funding campaigns for years, building relationships with district leaders, judges, city council members, She called in every favor. Suddenly, politicians who normally ignored Harlem started asking questions about the Bandy case. Why was Harrigan still on duty? Why hadn't the commissioner issued a statement? What kind of message was this sending? Adam Clayton Powell used his pulpit and his growing media presence to keep the story alive. He gave interviews to radio stations, appeared at community meetings, organized vigils outside the 28th precinct. He framed the Bandy beating not as an isolated incident, but as a symptom of systemic racism in law enforcement. A message that resonated far beyond Harlem. Meanwhile, Edward Dudley prepared a lawsuit, not just against Harrigan, but against the city itself. He documented patterns of police brutality in Harlem, case after case that had been ignored or buried. The Bandy beating was the centerpiece, but Dudley was building something bigger, a legal argument that the city was complicit in violence against its black citizens. 2 weeks passed. The pressure built. Newspapers that had initially ignored the story started covering it because the political implications were becoming too significant to avoid. Radio stations hosted debates about police conduct. Community organizations rallied around Robert Bandy, who became a symbol of every black person who'd ever been brutalized by those sworn to protect them. Commissioner Valentine found himself in an impossible position. He could continue to protect Harrigan and face a lawsuit that would expose decades of department misconduct. He could fire Harrigan and face backlash from the police union, or he could do something unprecedented. Bumpy Johnson made sure Valentine understood there was only one acceptable choice. The exact conversation between Bumpy and the commissioner was never documented, but everyone knew it happened. Bumpy had connections to organized crime families that had connections to city officials. He had financial leverage through businesses, legitimate and otherwise. He had political power through the votes he could mobilize and the donations he could direct. Most importantly, he had moral authority in Harlem. When Bumpy said something needed to happen, the entire community moved as one. Valentine received a message, delivered through intermediaries but crystal clear in its meaning. This ends with an apology. A public apology. On the radio, to Robert Bandy, to Harlem, and it ends with Harrigan fired, not suspended, not reassigned, but permanently removed from law enforcement. Or the lawsuit proceeds, the protests intensify, and every dirty secret in the department's history becomes front-page news. October 29, 1945, 7 p.m. Commissioner Louis Valentine sat in a radio studio at WNYC, New York City's municipal station. Across from him sat Robert Bandy, his face still showing the yellowish remnants of bruises, his broken ribs taped beneath his shirt. Behind the glass stood Adam Clayton Powell, Edward Dudley, and several reporters. Bumpy Johnson wasn't there. He never needed to be physically present to make his presence felt. The broadcast began. Valentine's voice was stiff, formal, the voice of a man doing something he never imagined he'd have to do. He spoke about the incident on October 12th. He acknowledged that Trooper William Harrigan had acted inappropriately. He stated that Harrigan had been dismissed from the force, and then, with thousands of New Yorkers listening through their radios, Commissioner Valentine did the unprecedented thing. He apologized, not a vague institutional apology, not a bureaucratic expression of regret, a direct personal apology to Robert Bandy for the violence inflicted upon him by a representative of law enforcement, an acknowledgement that what happened was wrong, unjustifiable, a violation of everything the police were supposed to represent. Robert Bandy sat quietly during the apology. When the commissioner finished, the interviewer asked if he had anything to say. Bandy's voice was steady, measured, the voice of a teacher who'd spent his life choosing words carefully. I accept the commissioner's apology, but I want people to understand something. This wasn't about me. This happens every day in Harlem, in black neighborhoods across this city, across this country. What makes today different isn't that it happened, it's that someone with power decided it mattered. That has to change. We can't depend on powerful men deciding which injustices to care about. We need systems that protect everyone, regardless of who's watching. The broadcast ended. The apology was on record, preserved in the radio station's archives, impossible to deny or walk back. In Harlem, people gathered in living rooms and bars, around radios, hearing a police commissioner apologize to one of their own. For many, it was the first time they'd ever heard power humble itself before a black man. It didn't undo the beating, it didn't erase generations of brutality, but it proved something crucial. That power could be held accountable if the right pressure was applied in the right way. Bumpy Johnson sat in his office and allowed himself a rare smile. This was how you change the game. Not through violence that could be dismissed as criminality, not through protests that could be ignored, but through strategic pressure applied with surgical precision, forcing those in power to acknowledge publicly what they'd always denied privately. William Harrigan disappeared from public life. Some said he left New York entirely, took a job in security somewhere no one knew his name. Others claimed he tried to join other police departments and found every door mysteriously closed. The truth was, after what happened, Harrigan was marked. He'd become an example of what happened when you touched what Bumpy Johnson protected. Robert Bandy returned to teaching. His story became legend in Harlem, not just the beating, but the unprecedented apology that followed. Students who never knew him personally grew up hearing about Professor Bandy, the man whose dignity was restored by forces most people didn't even know existed. But those who understood how Harlem really worked knew the truth. The apology came because Bumpy Johnson decided it would, and that decision sent a message that echoed far beyond one beating, one teacher, one radio broadcast. It said that Harlem wasn't defenseless, that its people had protectors who could touch power itself, that crossing certain lines would bring consequences even City Hall couldn't avoid. Years later, historians would debate the legacy of men like Bumpy Johnson. Criminals, yes, violence, certainly, operating outside the law, by definition, but also protectors of communities that official institutions abandoned, enforcers of justice when legal systems provided none. Complicated men in complicated times, wielding power in the only ways available to people locked out of legitimate authority. The Bandy case illustrated that complexity perfectly. The police, who were supposed to protect citizens, brutalized them. The courts, which were supposed to deliver justice, ignored them. The media, which was supposed to tell truth, dismissed them. So the community turned to the power structure that actually responded, the underground network of numbers, runners, and policy banks, and men like Bumpy Johnson who understood that respect meant nothing if you didn't protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Was it right? That's the question without easy answers. In a just system, Robert Bandy wouldn't have been beaten in the first place. In a functional society, an apology would have come immediately through proper channels. But 1945. Harlem existed in neither a just system nor a functional society. It existed in America, where being black and walking down the street could get you brutalized with impunity. So the community used the tools it had, and one of those tools was Bumpy Johnson. Today, you can find Robert Bandy's story in archives, footnotes, in histories of Harlem and civil rights struggles. You can hear the radio broadcast in recordings preserved by WNYC. You can see the photographs Marcus Webb took, now housed in the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Physical proof that this happened, that one teacher's suffering became a moment when power bent toward justice. But the deeper story, the strategy, the pressure, the network that made the apology happen, that lives primarily in oral history. Old-timers who remember how things really worked. Families who passed down the truth about who protected them when no one else would. Historians who understand that official records only tell part of the story, that real power in marginalized communities often operated in shadows because it had no other choice. What would you have done if you were Robert Bandy, bloodied on a sidewalk while police brutality continued with impunity? If you were a parent in Harlem, knowing your children faced violence from those meant to protect them? If you were Bumpy Johnson, watching a teacher beaten and knowing you had the power to force accountability? These questions don't have comfortable answers, but they're worth asking because the dynamics they reveal about power, justice, community, and the compromises people make when systems fail them, those dynamics didn't disappear in 1945. They evolved, adapted, took new forms, but the fundamental reality remained. When official justice fails, communities find their own justice. And sometimes that justice comes from unexpected places. The legacy of that October evening isn't just an apology. It's a lesson about how change happens when all legitimate avenues are blocked, about strategic pressure and political leverage and the courage to demand accountability from those who think they're untouchable, about communities protecting their own through whatever means available. Robert Bandy taught mathematics for 30 more years. He never forgot the beating, but he also never forgot the apology. Not because it erased what happened, but because it proved that even in 1945 Harlem, even against the police commissioner of New York City, power could be checked by those who understood how to wield their own power strategically. And every student he taught after that night carried a piece of that lesson forward. That dignity matters, that community matters, that sometimes justice comes through official channels, and sometimes it comes because someone with power decides injustice has gone far enough. That's the story they don't teach in schools, but it's the story that shaped Harlem and countless communities like it for generations. If you found this story powerful, share it. These histories need to be told, remembered, understood in all their complexity. Leave a comment about what this story means to you, about moments when justice came from unexpected places, about the complicated legacy of figures who operated outside the law but inside the community's trust. And subscribe, because there are hundreds more stories like this. Forgotten moments when ordinary people faced extraordinary injustice and found extraordinary ways to fight back, when communities protected themselves through networks most people never knew existed, when power, for just a moment, bent toward accountability. History is more complicated, more morally ambiguous, and more instructive than the sanitized versions we're usually told. This is the real history, the uncomfortable history. The history that teaches us how change actually happens when all the proper channels fail. Remember Robert Bandy. Remember the beating. Remember the apology. Remember who made that apology happen. And remember that justice, real justice, sometimes requires power, meeting power on its own terms. That's the lesson of October 1945, and it's as relevant today as it was then.